After a late spring record-breaking heatwave and a summer of extreme heat here in the UK, what impact has this had on the nation's farmers?
We want to be harvesting normally at the end of September, but with no rain, the plant is just dying on its feet, and if we're not careful, it will become inedible.
Hello, I'm Clare Nasir. Welcome to Climate Conversations. One sector feeling the sharpest effects of climate change is farming. Across the UK, growers and livestock keepers are living the extremes at both ends of the year. Wetter winters and hotter summers with uneven and at times unreliable rainfall. The latest State of the UK Climate Report 2025 shows the UK has grown steadily wetter since the 1980s, and it's our winters driving that change. The winter half year is now 13% wetter than it was between 1961 and 1990. Summers, though, tell a different story. There's no clear sign that very dry summer months are becoming more frequent, despite that both 2025 and 2026 saw significant dry spells. Spring 2025 was England's driest in over 100 years, and the summer that followed was drier than average almost everywhere outside Scotland. Back to 2026, and the agricultural sector has faced an escalating crisis with prolonged summer heatwaves and record low rainfall across England and Wales. Following the driest July in nearly 2 centuries, parched conditions have severely threatened national food security, crop yields and livestock welfare. In August, the government announced a £65 million emergency support package to assist struggling farmers and fast-track water infrastructure. Professor Pete Falloon is a science lead here at the Met Office. Here he talks to Alex Burkill about the connection between climate science and agriculture.
Pete, welcome to Climate Conversations. Thanks for coming on this show about agriculture. And before we dive in, could you tell us a bit more about your role and also the role of the Met Office when it comes to the agriculture industry?
I'm science lead for food security at the Met Office. What that means basically is that I look after and oversee all of the science, whether it's looking at the UK, whether it's looking at international security. A particular thing that I'm looking after has been a long-term relationship with DEFRA, the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. We provide them with something called a Food, Farming and Natural Environment Climate Service. What that means in reality is it's not running climate models and looking at climate projections and the very, if you like, the fundamental climate science. What we're trying to do with the information those models produce is take it and make it more relevant for decision makers.
So what are the biggest causes of concern, the biggest things that you're looking at when we talk about our changing climate and agriculture?
The main thing really that's a concern in terms of climate change for agriculture and food systems isn't so much the gradual long-term changes in temperature or rainfall around the world. It's really the extremes of climate that are of concern. So things like flooding, heavy rainfall, longer periods of drought, like heat waves, high temperatures, sea level rise, those sorts of things that are probably more impactful for farming in the food system.
Someone with direct experience of extreme weather is dairy farmer Ian Baggs. Here he describes the changeable conditions on his farm in Dorset.
So we're down here on the River Frome on the floodplains, and it's hard to believe, but in winter the water will be waist deep where I'm stood, potentially for, usually it used to be days or weeks, now it could be months at a time throughout the winter. But then in summer we have such low rainfalls that the river level drops, and you can see behind me a typical problem is that the neighbours' cattle cross from their land to ours, so we have to put up temporary fences like what you see behind me. And what's bizarre is that that used to happen maybe only in July, August. Now it might go all the way from May to September where the river's so low that the cattle can cross.
As many of us have felt during summer 2026, heat is one of the hardest forms of extreme weather to manage. The most recent decade has been 1.33 degrees warmer than the 1961-1990 average. But it's the extremes that are moving fastest. Across eastern counties, from Lincolnshire to Kent, the average hottest day of the year has warmed more than 4.5 degrees. And the records keep falling, with 2025 becoming the UK's warmest year on record, the 6th time that record has been broken this century alone. For farmer Ian Baggs, the effect of heat on crops is plain to see.
So we're here in a field of maize, which hasn't had rain for over 2 months, and it's had a very challenging season. This is a really important crop for feeding cattle through the winter. Normally we'd expect a plant which would be perhaps 8 or 9 feet tall and cobs that are significantly larger, but I've seen bigger baby sweet corns than this. So here we are in a field with some dry cows and heifers, so they're effectively not being milked, they're on their summer holiday. Normally these cattle would be grazing pasture, but the ground is that barren and dry, no grass has grown. So right now we're actually feeding silage, which you can see in these ring feeders, which we typically preserve for the winter, but we're having to feed that in summer because we've got no grass. And you can see it here, this is actually a whole crop of oats and vetch, which I bought from a nearby arable farmer. It's a sustainable crop, no artificial fertiliser, it's good quality food. I just don't want to feed it now. I want to feed it in winter.
To cope with dry conditions, Ian has turned to more diverse feed crops, but this year even these have struggled.
So one of the things we've tried to do to become more climate resilient is plant what we call diverse lays or herbal lays. A lay is a field of grass effectively, and we can see in this one lots of different species that we've planted. For example, the most common grass, ryegrass, and that's 90% of grass seed sales in the UK, that's dead or dormant, but the cocksfoot grass, which is deep rooting, is still growing a little bit. The red clover, which can fix nitrogen, that's very deep rooted and that's growing reasonably well. Plantain, chicory here as well. These things are still growing with their deeper roots, but ultimately, while we've done what we can in sowing the right species, there's a limit to what we can achieve. And with no rainfall, nothing's going to be here in abundance to feed our cattle.
While recent months have been characterised by hot, dry conditions, the biggest challenge for farmers and growers is the swing from one weather event to another.
For some of the decisions farmers make, effectively once they're made for a season. You know, so if they choose a crop and it's a crop that grows for 6 months plus or something, 9 months, then actually there's not very much that they can do. We often tend to think of climate change as being, like a smooth line or something. So, the average temperatures are going to get warmer and the high temperatures and the heat waves are going to sort of move along in a smooth way, and the extreme rainfall events, we're going to gradually see them increasing a bit more. But actually, recent science from the Met Office has shown that might not be the case, particularly for things like heavy rainfall events.
It's easy to forget that at the beginning of 2026, the problem was too much rain. Away from Western Scotland, North West England and North West Wales, rainfall ran well above the seasonal norm. Across England and Wales in particular, relentless wet weather left farmland waterlogged, holding up field work and pushing back planting.
So all of this is underwater during the winter, potentially for weeks or months on end. And what that means is that a lot of the grasses that are quite productive and vegetative and the cattle want to eat them and grow well on them actually die out, and the species that live are the things that the cattle don't want to eat, like rushes, sedges, docks. In winter, this is weed matter that's built up where the fence has been over my waist height, and all the weed gets washed along with the floodwater. I remember standing here about 2 years ago, and that piece of land was actually joined to this field, and the significant rainfall events of the last 2 winters caused the channel to erode through. All of this was underwater and create an oxbow, and you can see how it's just completely washed away the ground with the massive flows of water through the winter. And now here we are in summer, the river level is significantly lower, and there's fears about lack of water.
Another feature of our warming climate is a shift towards milder winters. The most recent decade has seen, on average, more than over 2 weeks fewer frosts per year compared to the period 1961 to 1990. And a hard winter freeze, the kind that once kept problems in the soil in check, is now far less reliable. A Apart from damaging weather, mild winters can present farmers with another challenge in the form of pests and diseases. Here's Professor Pete Falloon.
It is complicated because for some pests they'll be very more tolerant to dry conditions, some will be more tolerant to wet conditions and different times of the year, and will depend on the crop being at a certain stage for them to have a significant impact. But overall I think it is a growing concern. I'd also mention there's lots of work in the Met Office looking at this from two angles really. One of them is a web tool, an internet tool that basically can look at priority plant health pests in particular and uses climate information to predict where across the country those pests might emerge in any given year. The other one is using what we call atmospheric dispersion models, and the team there basically use them to move around what we call the vectors of some pests in particular. So it's often the case that insects or midges and other things move around the pests and diseases, and because those insects move around in the atmosphere as would other particles, things like dust or and so on, then actually those models can be used to predict if we know there's been an outbreak here, where might they go in the future, or to look the other way.
To highlight the risks of airborne pests, at the time of recording, livestock farmers are on high alert as cases of blue tongue, a disease spread by midges, soar across parts of the UK, a consequence of the recent dry weather. With the agricultural industry facing a host of environmental pressures, what does this mean for the consumer?
We've seen a massive decline in the amount of dairy farmers in the UK, from over 20,000 in the year 2000 to now, just 26 years later, there's less than 7,000 of us. So we're under extreme pressure economically to survive. Ultimately, I think two things are going to happen. We're going to see fewer cattle in the landscape, and the consumer could end up paying higher prices for their milk, or alternatively, we import it, which could mean other nations going without.
As the impacts of climate change continue to be felt across the UK, how are they shaping the landscape itself?
Climate change tends to push things further north, basically, push things further upwards, up hills, and in terms of elevation as well as further up the country. We tend to tune our crops quite well so that they perform really well in a current climate or a current location. So we might see wheat, moving a bit further north, perhaps in terms of the productive regions. If you look really far ahead, there have been some studies by the University of Exeter as well that have suggested, because of water shortages and heat and things like this, that actually where we grow lots of the crops in the UK, the east of England, might be much less suitable, might not be so viable, might be more suitable for grassland. So there could be some big changes. But having said this, that's also not straightforward, because the land isn't always suitable. We tend to, not just because the west is cooler and wetter, to have livestock systems there, but also the land's typically more hilly. So, having bigger crop fields and flat fields works really well. So there are some interesting challenges, I think, in the longer term as well as in the near term.
So how must and why must farms evolve with our changing climate?
Well, I think there are a number of ways. I think in a way we have to sort of start with what the impacts might be, and as we mentioned earlier, it's probably really the extreme events that are more concerning. So it might mean things like planting more heat or drought tolerant crops in areas that might be affected by heavy rainfall and heavier bursts of rainfall, perhaps more waterlogging resistant crops. In pasture systems, it might mean deeper rooting systems that could access water deeper down, or more diverse grass mixtures. Farmers might need to think about when they go about their work. So in the heat of the day, it might be really challenging, and moving animals around as well. Looking after the soil's really important, because if we build up soil organic matter and look after the soil structure, it can hold on to more water, both in the periods of drought, so there's more available, but also in very wet periods, so it might help hold back flooding. I think the good news I point out, though, is that the majority of these sorts of things are practical farming measures, adaptation practices aren't necessarily new. They're often things that are already being done or are already out there. It might just mean that we need to slightly shift the emphasis and embrace change in that way.
As farmers adapt to a changing climate, what does Ian Baggs say to those who suggest agriculture is part of the problem?
Of course agriculture has a climate impact. I think every industry does, from manufacturing to travel, shipping, logistics, data centres. One thing that's unique about farming is that we've got the opportunity to be part of the solution rather than just a smaller part of the problem. By sucking carbon down and sequestering it in our soils, by planting more trees and hedges, by improving our practices, we can be part of the solution.
Despite the negative impacts, climate change does offer some limited benefits to farmers, including more sunlight hours and extended growing periods. Growing degree days, a measure of the accumulated warmth crops need to develop, has climbed steadily since the 1980s. In fact, 2025 set a new record for the highest growing degree days in a series going back to 1931. Going forward, the Met Office is also looking to offer more support to the agriculture industry.
So you touched on how farms could develop
Yeah.
with the future and how they're going to adapt. How do you think your work's going to evolve with our changing climate and the requirements coming from you?
I think really it's and it has been evolving actually more towards a need for more practical advice, and for that advice getting into the industry and working more closely with farmers and farming organisations and the wider food industry. Farmers often get involved in trials or pilot studies or what they call farm clusters, where they'll do new things together and learn with each other. Myself and colleagues have been getting out talking a lot to industry conferences over the recent years, to farmers and food producers and so on. But actually really excited this year that we have a new partnership with something called catchment sensitive farming, which is basically part of Natural England and the Environment Agency. They have farm advisors who have been advising farmers on better farming practices to support healthy catchments and healthy rivers and so on. And we're going to trial taking out some climate adaptation advice through this partnership.
For now, farmer Ian Baggs has his eyes set firmly on the future.
When you run a business that is intrinsically linked to the changes in the climate, you see it in how your business operates, in how financially successful or not you are, and there's no avoiding it. I really hope that in 20 or 30 years' time, my daughter will be able to carry on in my footsteps and keep cattle grazing on the land. We're really lucky to have the British people who want to buy our product, and we have to be optimistic about the future to face the challenges that are coming our way.
That's it for this edition of Climate Conversations. Our thanks to Met Office scientist Professor Pete Falloon, farmer Ian Baggs, and my co-host Alex Burkill. I'm Clare Nasir. Thanks for watching.